Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today to talk all about Shadow AI. I am Simon Duplessis. I am the IT practice director here at Cloud Clever, so basically responsible for everything with the cloud around it or a plug attached. And I've got Milo joining me.
Hello, good morning, everybody. My name's Milo Shepherd. I'm a Microsoft 365 solutions architect at Enforcer. Enforcer work with Cloud Clever to make sure we can deliver secure and scalable Microsoft solutions to all of their lovely customers.
Great. So over the next 40 minutes, we'll cover what Shadow AI is, the risks it creates. We'll see why it's so hard to see. And then go through some practical steps on how we're going to tackle this challenge. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A section. If there's time in the end, we'll cover those. Otherwise, we'll follow up with you afterwards and we'll share the results. So I like the iceberg analogy when it comes to AI. We all sort of see the front end, the little tip at the top where you're filling in a prompt on a website or there's an app or an integration with something, but we don't really understand what's happening in the background. So we're going to try and make sure that your organization is not like the Titanic. We're going to sidestep it. The problem isn't the AI itself. It's the gap between what organizations think they can see and control and what is actually happening across your users, your data, and your devices. So let's start with what we actually think Shadow AI means. Milo, can you explain it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, when we when we talk about shadow AI, we probably have to wind back a little bit and talk about shadow IT first of all, which kind of came first. And what's a good example of shadow IT? Well, let's say someone in your business, for example, signed up. Maybe someone in your marketing team signed up for something like Adobe Photoshop, but they used their personal email address to sign up and buy a subscription, right? That tool is now essentially invisible to the IT team, right? It's not been bought through the IT usual process, and so that tool is now kind of sitting in the shadows, right? Hence the name. And shadow AI is kind of an extension of that, right? So as people are starting to use more AI tools and maybe even bring their own AI tools to work, these AI tools are now also part of that sort of shadow IT, sort of bucket there. So shadow AI is essentially people using unsanctioned tools or bringing their own tools to work that the IT team hasn't had a chance to build a process for and doesn't really have visibility of. So can be quite tricky to secure.
And I think a good example we spoke about a couple of days ago is something like Photoshop or another. Let's pick on marketing again. A tool. All the vendors just want to have their tool AI enabled. If let's say you're using a marketing contractor, they have their own agency. They sign into their tools with their own personal email address. They work on your with your data, with your tools, and that gets synced out of your organization. And you don't even have visibility. You don't know that that's happening. You're not aware of it, so you can't control it. So
Yeah.
well, somewhat.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's just one of those things. People are just trying to get their job done, right? And they want to use the best tool for the job. So if there's not a tool in that space that the IT team has sanctioned or looked at, then users are going to do the thing that's easiest for them. They'll go and sign up for a tool that they know works. Maybe they've used it at a previous company. Maybe they've used it in their in their personal life, right? So that's why it's important to try and sort of keep an eye on these things as they start to crop up.
And I've got some stats. We'll just have a quick look. The references there at the bottom, but yeah, as you can see, all organizations, users are already using AI, and if don't have sanctioned AI tools, they will use their own tools, or they'll just use it in their personal lives, which will be an app installed on a mobile device. Take a photo of your screen. Yeah, as if things are locked down completely, users will always find a way around it.
Yeah, 100%. And I know some of those are around small business, but I heard a stat recently from Microsoft that 80% of people globally are also bringing their own AI tools to work at the moment. So it's definitely the demand is definitely there for it, right?
Absolutely. So now that we have an idea of what shadow AI is, let's talk about how it's getting into your business. Who is the perpetrator? Is it a foreign threat actor? Is it a hacker? No, it's a well-meaning employee who just wants to do a better job. You know, free tools like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, browser extensions. You know, there's even AI features, like we mentioned earlier, switched on inside every day. It's a SaaS apps, tools that can potentially pose a risk to you. So the majority of these tools aren't bad. There's just a couple of questions to consider around it. So what account did the user log into when they signed up for the tool? If it's a personal account, your data will automatically be synchronized outside of the organization. With some of these tools as well, your data will be used to train the model. Now, what that means is if someone else that uses that tool asks a question, it can potentially use your data to help answer that question. So, you know, IP data, anything that's really, really sensitive to the organization, don't share it with an AI tool unless you've got full controls around it. And also from a GDPR compliance perspective, I love Claude in Excel. It's amazing. It fixes formulas and it does everything for me. But
Oh, yeah,
we've got
fantastic.
that. Yeah, we've got that very carefully locked down. But because anything you put in there, that can potentially be shared with the model by default, unless you know which settings to change. So adoption is accelerating faster than most organizations can govern. There are three key drivers for this. It takes seconds to adopt these tools. There's real productivity pressure on staff, and vendors are turning on the features by default to be the latest and the greatest and the best. So when this happens at scale, think about a large organization, it creates a new category of exposure. So let's look at the risks.
Yeah, it's an interesting one there. I think it's interesting the way you talk about a sort of well-meaning employee, right? There's a term we use in the IT industry quite a lot, which is insider threat, right? And insider threat kind of sounds a little bit scary, right? You know, it almost sounds like somebody trying to do something nasty within the business. But actually, an insider threat doesn't necessarily mean somebody doing something malicious, right? It could just be, somebody accidentally copying in the wrong David into their email, right? And it gets sent to somebody outside the organization, but really you wanted to send it to David in finance, right? It could be some really sensitive financial information. So accidents do happen, and that's kind of some of the stuff that we're looking to protect against as well, right? It's the sort of accidental stuff and the difficult stuff to keep on top of. So look, I'll talk a little bit here about the sort of four key risk areas for unmanaged AI, and the first one here is data, and data is arguably the most valuable digital asset that you have in your business, right? And the sort of risk here is twofold. So first of all is data actually being initially surfaced to the wrong people internally, right? As we start to use things like Copilot, or even just apps like Claude, Cowork, or ChatGPT, stuff that we've actually sort of linked into our Microsoft account. If we don't have the right sort of data governance sort of processes in place there, and the right security permissions, and the right sets of controls around like data loss prevention and sensitivity labeling, right? It could be that people are starting to access stuff that they shouldn't have access to, and this is data and files and folders that they may have already been able to access before, but they didn't know it. And as we start to use tools like AI, they're going to they're really good at searching across your whole index, across all your files. So they'll be able to present information to the user that they didn't even know they had access to, and that could be potentially dangerous, right? But the second risk around data is, then sharing that data externally, right? So once they've had this data surface, they might want to share it out with someone. Maybe they're working with a partner, or they want to post something on LinkedIn, right? So if they've then had access to that really sensitive information, there's a real risk that they could share that externally easily if you don't have the right controls in place. Whereas if we have things like maybe a sensitivity label in place, we'd be able to maybe mark that piece of data as confidential, and that would stop it actually being shared outside the organization, maybe via an email, via a Teams message, maybe downloading it to a USB stick or something like that. Moving on, then the next sort of risk area is people, and data is arguably our most valuable digital asset. Well, people are arguably our most valuable physical asset, right? People are the most important thing in our business, and the way people interact with the data, so it kind of links back to data in some form, is about sort of ownership and responsibility. So different departments will have different responsibilities for their data, how it's stored, how it's shared, but also how well it's kept, right? Is the data being well organized, or is it starting to look a bit like that drawer in your kitchen at the end of the counter that you just sort of shove everything into, and it ends up being a bit of a mess? You've got keys to the garage that don't even work. You've got dead batteries and things like that. Loads of bits, and it's all a bit of a jumble. And if you have to find anything, usually you have to pull the whole drawer out to find out what's going on. So, having sort of poor data hygiene or sort of process around that, leads to a lot of, we should really tidy that up kind of thoughts, or, why are we still keeping this, key which doesn't even work in a lock anymore, or, we'll sort of sort that out later. So making sure that the people that have ownership of the data in their different departments understand what that looks like, where the sort of boundaries of what they're responsible for is, but also how they should be keeping it in terms of organization, making sure it's in the right folder structure and not just, bunged into the root of the HR folder or the finance folder there. It is really important. So having process around, who owns the data and how they look after it is really important. Next is a sort of operational risk, right? So as we're starting to use AI and use things like unsanctioned apps, if people are bringing their own tools to work, their own chat GPT subscription, their own Claude subscription, if that's not sanctioned by the business, this can start to create a sort of split process within the business, right? So if one person's using their own chat GPT subscription, right, to, process a piece of data or work on a particular workflow, right, not everyone's going to have access to that app, right? So now you're starting to have kind of split processes. One person's doing something one way, another person's doing something another way. And that could even be within the same team, right? So as people are then starting to build out new workflows, this can then lead to inconsistent workflows, not just within the business, again, could be within the same team, right? If somebody's created a process where they use co-work in Excel, for example, to, process a certain like monthly financial report, but another person in the finance team doesn't have access to it because you've used your personal account. Now, two people are doing things two different ways. And not only is that inefficient, but it can also just lead to some real confusion with the way you actually work day to day with these workflows. And then the last sort of key risk area here is compliance, right? Are these tools that we're using compliant with regulations that we're adhering to, or processes that we've defined within our business? And are they doing a good enough job at making sure that you're compliant with those? So think about things like GDPR. Think about things like ISO 27001. There'll be a fair few of you that will have gone through that process, and you'll have written out a lot of processes on how you store data and how you operate with it. Bringing AI tools into the mix there can really start to alter that. And if you're not sure exactly what's going on with it, suddenly you could be, doing things that you shouldn't be as per the processes and procedures that you've set out in your sort of regulations there for 27001, for example. So think about, who has actually vetted these tools, right? Probably no one if you've sort of signed up for it yourself, right? Maybe you've looked at it and go, oh, this is going to really help me in my day. But I haven't actually had anyone in the business, the IT team, the sort of management team look over this and making sure that it's adhering with those regulations or our internal processes. So those are sort of four key risk areas we see when we start to think about how using unmanaged tools can affect our business.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Milo. So I'll take you through a little example, and I think this is something very common that we will see in businesses. And I think then we're done with the scaremongering, and we'll move maybe into how we can help you address this risk. So I'm an intern at a technology company. I've been asked to put together a summary prior to a meeting on AI strategy. Each of the participants have forwarded me a 10-page Word document with their thoughts. I've left it a little bit late, and now I need to very quickly get all of this summarized and ready for that meeting. What would you do? Well, I would find a tool that can help me do all of that work automatically, and that's the risk. It's not sanctioned. We, yeah, if that user goes out on the internet and Googles and finds the summary tool, likely the first 10 results would be a tool that's not sanctioned, offering you either a free trial, or it will just be a free tool, which means you are the product, you are the data that's being sold. But if you have the governance in place and you enable your users by providing them with sanctioned tools, that they'll be able to use the tool securely and safely.
Yeah, absolutely. Chat GPT is like so well known now. It's probably the first place that people will reach to, right? If you ask anyone about AI, the first thing almost always they'll think of is ChatGPT, right? And obviously we have Claude that's sort of coming into the frame a bit more now, as a sort of strong competitor there. But this is that's a very real scenario, right? We've seen real instances of this happening, and this has actually been happening for some time. ChatGPT has actually been around for a little while now, and back in 2023, end of 2023, there, Samsung actually had some of their internal source code and some of their internal meeting notes leaked, right? Had someone that was using ChatGPT, and they were, again, putting this data in to help them summarize the source code as well as some of their internal meeting notes, and sort of help them in this exact scenario that you described there, Simon. They were trying to get something done quickly, be more efficient, make the most of their time, and these tools are fantastic at helping us do that. Um, but this obviously led to their sensitive data being leaked, and subsequently, what happened is Samsung then actually banned AI chatbots across the business, right? Um, and it sounds like a sensible thing, right? It's leaking our data. We need to ban it. But actually, think about the productivity hit that you're taking then by not having a sanction out there. You're at risk of essentially slowing your workforce down at that point. And so, look, if we can think about a smart way to approach this, where we can give people a well communicated and properly secured option, then they can still get those productivity gains without the risks that we've talked about here.
Really, really good point. But why are we not protected against this? I think if we look at the traditional security measures we put in place, we talk about modern workplace, we talk about conditional access. The first thing we protect is the identity of the user. So we make sure the user has got a secure password, they've got MFA enabled. We make sure that they can only access your company data from a device that's owned and or controlled by the organization. Think about your company mobiles. We secure that. We make sure there's a password on there. It's up to date. If the user loses the device, we can wipe it. But what have we got in place at the moment that stops the user from opening a random browser, pasting some of your data into that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. We bang on about this a lot in Enforcer about identity being the new perimeter, right? We've kind of gone from the sort of older days, right? And this is, I guess, a big turning point for this was COVID, right? Pre-COVID, we had a lot of people still working in the office, and so securing your data and securing your applications, a lot of that just meant securing what was within the four walls of your office, right? We could have a firewall that protected the network and all your servers, and those things are still important, right? We need to still protect your servers and your internal network and everything you've got going on in there. But as post COVID now, we've got a much more distributed workforce. People working from home, people are working from airports. Some people are even working in a plane in the sky now. We've got great Wi-Fi on planes. So, that sort of boundary that we have to protect is no longer just in the office, right? We have to shift that protection up to the identity level. And what do I mean by that? It kind of means that I need to now protect where people are signing in, right? People are signing in to Office 365, right? Microsoft 365, where a lot more of our data is now stored in SharePoint, is stored in OneDrive, is stored in Teams. Maybe we're using Microsoft Loop or other things like that to be able to sort of collaborate and do work there. So, we need to be a little bit smarter about how we're protecting that. We can't just protect the office anymore. We have to think a little bit wider. And Microsoft gives us some great tools that allow us to do that. So, what we're able to start thinking about now as we shift into a more sort of AI focused world where, it's integrating with a lot more of your Microsoft 365 data, your SharePoint, your Teams, even your emails, right? And your Teams meetings as well. Now we can start to sort of leverage a few sort of smarter technologies to really understand where those gaps are. Again, we still need things to protect the office. We still need those protections against our identities to log in. So MFA, blocking legacy authentication, things like that. All that stuff is still really important. But this thing is moving all the time, right? Technology is an ever evolving thing, and AI is really just going to accelerate that. And what I always say is, AI is kind of like an amplifier for whatever practice you have in place, right? If you have a good security practice in place, AI will amplify that and it will make you more efficient in a really secure way. But if you're amplifying a bad configuration and things are a little bit shaky underneath, that's going to very quickly go downhill and cause you a lot more problems a lot more quickly.
I like the idea of the amplification. I mean, that's a really good way to put it. Taking a step back, there's growing pressure from the board. Insurers are asking a lot more questions around this. Customers are, your regulators, if you're working in a tender environment, there are now specific sections asking about AI and governance. And we really need to be much clearer in evidencing it. So a lot of organizations currently sit in this assumed visibility. We assume it's being taken care of. And what we would want to do is sort of take you through this journey. So the first step is getting visibility and making sure we can see what tools users are using.
Yeah, 100%. I think we see as we speak with a lot of partners, not just in the IT space, but also just in in the small to medium business space as well, is that um, if they're talking with more partners that they work with, and like you say, responding to things like RFPs, right? These are actual requirements they're putting in. They're asking to see things like their Microsoft Secure Score, but also understand like their data posture as well. Like, have you got these specific measures in place to protect you from these newer sort of threats? So things like sensitivity labels, data loss prevention, right? That's actually being asked. And while this might seem like more sort of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, I think what it really demonstrates is that actually, as businesses now, we have a real opportunity to set ourselves aside from the rest of the players in the market, right? So if you are responding to a tender and you're able to have a good practice in place there, this is actually going to put you in really good stead for potentially winning these bids for tenders, right? So if you can take action now and start to look at some of these and really think about these foundations that set us up really well for AI, and just working with a more distributed workforce where data's flying around everywhere, then when it comes to these situations, whether it's a cyber insurance renewal or a tender bid that you're going for, you're going to be able to put yourself a cut above the rest, and really put yourself in the running for winning these things, or keeping your insurance premiums low, for example.
Brilliant. Shall we have a look at a report that we can
Absolutely.
sort of demonstrate some visibility to the audience?
Excellent. So, we're sort of really pleased to be partnering with Cloud Clever to sort of help them deliver on some of this visibility, right? And so, where we sort of help them with some of this extra visibility is really looking into your Microsoft 365 environment and being able to see exactly where these sort of shadow AI apps are popping up. So on the left here, you can see some sort of general statistics, right? And this example organization here, right? They've got 37% of the business is already using shadow AI, right? If you thought as a business owner or as a manager in your business, how many people in my business are using AI at the moment, right? You'd probably say, oh, well, we don't have a sanctioned app, so probably, not very many of them. Or, you might say, well, I've told them not to use ChatGPT, so they're not allowed to use it, but there's no actual controls in place to sort of govern that. So this will really help sort of expose where those gaps are, right? So 37% of people using shadow AI, 15 different shadow AI apps have been seen, right? So, it's amazing how many different tools are now available, whether it's things like ChatGPT, but other things like, Gamma, for example, used to help us create PowerPoint decks. Um, there's other tools as well. In this bit on the left here, there's one for superhuman Grammarly, right? So Grammarly is a tool that lots of businesses have been using for a long time now to help them with, drafting emails and spell checking and grammar correction, right? But with their new superhuman feature, they've actually brought an AI model into their tool. So it might not even be new tools that people are bringing in. It might be tools that they're actually already using, that company has brought an AI sort of measure into it. And like Simon was saying, they might have turned that on by default. So actually, without you bringing any new tools in, you might be exposing data to these AI models now without even realizing it. So even just those bits are really important. And there's also a bit on high risk apps there as well. We can see there's one high risk app there. As we look over to the right, we can actually start to break things down by each user. So we can see on a user per user level, how many sessions with these third party tools are they using, how much data is being transferred. And the data transfer is actually really important, right? If it's a low data transfer, They might only be using, the sort of chat functionality, right? Saying, hey, can you summarize these bullet points for me? But as I look down at, people like, user number 4 there, he's actually transferred, over 300 megabytes of data to Shadow AI tools. And to me, that would be saying, right, well, he's not just using the chat function. With that amount of data, he's actually uploading whole documents to it. And that could be a real risk for the business, right? And as we look on the right here, we can start to see the actual individual Shadow AI apps we're using. So we're actually able to tell at a per app level exactly what's being used, and that allows us to give them a risk score, right? Some of these sort of more well-known AI apps, although it is a risk to your business that they might be, uploading this data somewhere that's not sanctioned, there are lots of models out there, and some of these models might even be coming from nation states, for example. And if we see those, sort of crop up there, that could be even an even higher risk to your business. So we'll give each user a risk score based on the type of data they're uploading, how much data they're uploading, but also the different types of models they're using. So you can really get a good picture of where the risky users are, how many risky users you have, but also where you can then, identify an opportunity to put something in place that allows users to still be productive. You can see the demand in your business for it, but allow them to do it in a safe way that's not going to put you at risk. Um, and so, look, that sort of shows us what's going on today, but there's still other things that we have to do to make sure that we're ready for it, right? And Simon talked a little bit about this before, so making sure that we've got things like multi-factor authentication, turned on, making sure we're leveraging conditional access to, restrict and be really smart about where we're allowing logins into our Microsoft 365 environment, from what device, from which location, right? Um, but the Copilot readiness assessment report here will actually sort of help identify, where there are really good opportunities for you to start saving time here. We all want to be more productive. Things are getting more expensive by the day, and having to hire more people isn't necessarily feasible for every business right now. Times are times are always tough, right? But especially now, we want to be able to do more with the same amount of resources that we have. So how can we start saving that sort of 2.25 hours per user per week, right? So with this readiness assessment, we'll actually start to look into the different types of apps that your users are using within Microsoft 365, right? So if they're using lots of SharePoint and Teams and OneDrive and Outlook and Loop and Excel and Word, right? Then they're going to get a really good adoption score, right? If we gave them a Copilot license, they could actually be much more productive. And so what we'll do is we'll actually scan through your users, and be able to identify which departments in your business would actually benefit the most from a sanctioned tool, whether that be Copilot, whether that be Claude. And so you'll be able to actually identify, specific to your business, which departments are going to be the best places to start with AI. And usually, as we give these tools to those users that are going to get the most out of it, they'll then be great advocates for the rest of the business, and they'll be able to help spread the word and sort of teach other people in the business on how to use these tools, how they can get more out of it. So this really shows not just from a sort of value point of view, where am I going to get the most value out of a co-work license or a Claude license or a Copilot license, but also what areas do I need to button up from a security perspective, but also from a data governance perspective, right? So some of the key recommendations on the right we'll start to talk about, are there some other areas that we need to think about first, like, maybe looking at your SharePoint infrastructure to help, sort of tidy up some of the permissions there, or, better have the data managed and owned by different departments of the business, or maybe looking at using things like Microsoft Purview to apply different protections to the data. So things like sensitivity labels, data loss prevention policies to help, sensitive information you might be processing, like, ID information or credit card information, if that's something you're working with, and stop that being leaked outside your business as the users are starting to get more and more of that data potentially surface to them using these super powerful tools. So this readiness assessment is a really good place that you can come to really understand where those gaps are, but also understand how you can get the most out of using a sanctioned AI tool.
Absolutely. We've done a few of these assessments for a number of our clients now, and that first step, just getting visibility on what your users are using, and then using the Copilot readiness assessment to highlight, did you know your engineering team can use their tools in this way? Did you know your accounts team can use the Copilot plugin for Excel in a different way? Because let's face it, everyone in finance still loves to use Excel, even though they've got its proprietary tools for
Absolutely.
it. So please reach out. There'll be a QR code at the end of the meeting. I'll remind you again then. You can get in touch with us and we can do an assessment for you. So once we've done that, what's the next step? We can put some security controls in place. Now, the majority of attendees on this call will likely be on the business premium license, or perhaps you're lucky enough to be on E3 or E5, which makes it a little bit easier. But if you are on the business premium, there's a Defender suite and a Purview suite that are two add-on packages that you can get. You can think of the one literally as it is in the name. Defender is to defend. It allows us at a granular level to block which applications and which services your users are sanctioned to use. So we could start, for example, to say, well, all users are allowed to use Copilot because that's native and controlled within the Microsoft environment, but we would allow users to use Claude if they're using a work email and it's using SSO, which is single sign-on, which means they log in with their company email address. If they try to log in with a personal account, that will fail and they won't be able to share your company data externally. And then by default, we block all other AI tools. And that way you're enabling your users to use it safely. So the next step then is, right, your users are using it safely, but you need to evidence that. And that's where Purview comes in. It gives us really good granular logging of what your users are doing, what they're sharing with AI. And if you ever needed to evidence that, you've got that logging available to you.
Definitely. I think, with Microsoft bringing these new Purview Suite and Defender Suite add-ons, those are actually now a much better price point. But in times gone by, this sort of level of security was only really available in some of those sort of top tier enterprise SKUs, right? You had to be on E3, or a lot of times you had to be on E5 to be able to actually get these features. But now Microsoft has these other SKUs available, Defender Suite and Purview Suite, and they're actually available in a bundle as well, so you can get an even further discount if you take them both in one bundle. Then this brings that sort of enterprise grade sort of protection that was previously only reserved for the sort of best of the best. Now I can use that as at a much more attractive price point, and something that actually makes sense for my business, right? So these are fantastic tools, and we're able to really start to help leverage them, and also like standardize what we're doing in terms of security, especially as with AI ramping up. This is the we're currently at the point where this is the worst AI is ever going to be, right? It's only going to get better from here. So making sure we've got good protections in place from this point will just set you up for fantastic success with AI moving forwards.
And just to reiterate, when you mentioned DLP before, just for anyone in the audience that doesn't know what that is, it's data leak prevention. And what that allows us to do is actually classify and label all the documents you've got within your organization. And we can apply a specific label by default, or you can do it manually, or do it on specific sites. And for each label, we can associate permission. So we can say, for example, internal only means a document can only be opened by someone within your organization, and that permission is embedded within the file. So it doesn't matter if I email that out to a Gmail address, I copy it onto a memory stick, I share it with an AI tool. When that file is attempted to be accessed, it will pop up and check, does the user trying to access this have the relevant permission? No, they don't, and it won't allow them access. Similarly, you can go as granular as saying, well, these documents we don't even want users to be able to print,
Mm,
or we work with a specific partner, and with that partner these documents we're allowed to share and they can edit and open them. But if it goes anywhere else outside of that sort of that trust relationship, that you can't open those documents, you can't edit them, you can't read them. That's particularly useful for finance, or for HR as well, or if there's board level reporting you want to make sure it's really sensitive and secured. And in the worst case scenario, if you do get a breach and that data does get extricated outside of the organization, the data is still inaccessible. So it gives you that extra level of protection if the worst happens.
Yeah, no, and I think that you know the really important thing to mention, thing to remember there is that that protection travels with the data, right? And that's the most important bit. So no matter where the data goes, that protection is always applied. You know, previously when we were working, with sort of on-premise file servers, which a lot of people will still already be using, as we start to move more data into the cloud, where it can be, essentially accessed from anywhere, right? We need that data to be able to be protected no matter where it goes. So, it's not just, oh, I know who's got permission to this particular SharePoint site or this particular folder, right? It's all very well while that file or folder is in that location, but as soon as it travels out of it, that sort of protection falls away. So that's why things like, purview, sensitivity labels, data loss prevention are really important because they can travel with the data, and you've always got control of that protection no matter where it goes.
Right. So I think, shall we go through 5 steps to regain control of your AI environment?
Let's do it.
So, first thing, find out what AI is already in use. And I think we've evidenced that. Get in contact with us. We run a report. We show you these are the tools. And then as a business, you can decide which tools you would like your users to be able to use. Then, and this is the bit we didn't go into much detail, but yeah, a quick AI search or even Google will be able to help you with that. Look at a AI usage policy and set out clear guidelines to your user before you implement any level of protection. This is what we expect as an organization. These are the tools that are allowed, and this is the data we will allow you to share with AI. Once that's out there, we can, we could start protecting your most sensitive data. So we let's call it the crown jewels. We put the controls in place to say, yeah, this is really sensitive. This is PI. This is where there's a GDPR risk. Let's put really heavy controls around that data, and any other data users are allowed to share, for example. Then, really important, you have to have key owners. You need to have someone within your business responsible for this. Now, that might be at a departmental level. You could say each department lead is responsible for the data within their unit, or if you have a compliance department, that you could have someone in that department. But making sure there's a named owner, so that there's one person that is ultimately responsible for it, is really, really important. Otherwise, when the incident happens, it's a bit of a crazy mess on trying to figure out what's happened with the data. And then documenting everything. So building an evidence trail, and that's where Purview is really important because it means that everything is documented and there is a log of files being accessed across the board. Milo, anything to add?
I would just reiterate that sort of step one. To be honest, it's so important to get that visibility first of all, right? We don't know what we don't know, and so if we're not armed as a business owner or a manager with this, with the right knowledge and insight about what's going on, with our data, with these AI tools, then it's impossible for us to make a sensible decision about how we start securing it. So, getting the visibility first of all is so important. The risk of not having that visibility, leads to a risk of potentially not doing anything about it, and the risk of doing nothing could be very impactful.
Absolutely. So I think there's 3 key takeaways that we would like to leave you with. Shadow AI is already in your business. The risk is really visibility. It's not the AI itself. And you can enable AI safely with the right controls in place. Just like to firstly thank you everyone for joining us today for this call. Milo, really, really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us.
No, it's
There's
been a
a
great session. Thanks so much for having me.
there's a QR code on the screen if you'd like more information, or if you'd like to book in a session and do a review with us. I hope you found this really useful. Have a lovely rest of your day.